What was the one thing a Roman slave owner could never do? The question sounds almost ridiculous. In ancient Rome, a slave wasn't a person. They were legally classified as res, a thing, the same category as a bench, a decorative urn, or a goat with a nervous disposition. An owner could beat them, brand them, rent them out, gamble them away, or send them to die in the arena for serving slightly warm wine. Their power was supposed to be absolute, but hidden deep within Rome's vast legal code, buried under centuries of brutal tradition, were a handful of shocking things even the most powerful master was forbidden from doing, not because Rome discovered a conscience, but because they discovered something far more important: cold, hard efficiency. This is the twisted paradox of Roman power, a system of total control that was forced to build and limit, not to protect people, but to protect the property itself. Let's start with the ultimate power, the power of life and death. In early Rome, a master's authority was absolute. If your slave had a bad haircut, made eye contact at the wrong time, or just existed in a way you didn't like that morning, you could end them. It wasn't murder. It was disposal. No one would even blink. But by the height of the empire, something shifted. Emperors like Hadrian, the wall builder, not the razor, passed new reforms. Suddenly, you couldn't just execute your slave on a whim. You needed a good reason, and you had to get approval from a magistrate. It was bureaucratic homicide. But here's the part that still shocks historians. This law was almost pure theater. If you were rich and well connected, that magistrate was a friendly formality. He annoyed me was often reason enough. The real motivation wasn't justice. It was crowd control. The state had seen what happened when slaves were pushed too far. Spartacus and his rebellion left a permanent scar. They realized that letting aristocrats randomly butcher their workforce was a fantastic way to end up with a dagger in your back. So technically, an owner couldn't murder his slave without a process. But in practice, the law was written in invisible ink for anyone with the right name and enough money. If the law was fuzzy on killing, it was completely blind to another kind of violation. The concept of bodily autonomy simply didn't exist for a slave. An owner's access was assumed, universal, and without any legal consequence. There were no laws against exploitation because, in the eyes of the court, you couldn't violate your own property. The only legal recourse was if someone else harmed your slave. You could sue them, but not for the violation. For property damage. The court was concerned with depreciation, not dignity. This created a horrifying reality, especially for young slaves chosen for their beauty. They were living ornaments, expected to entertain guests in ways that had nothing to do with music or poetry. Later, under Christian emperors, vague laws about morality appeared. But they were for public show, a legal fig leaf on a monument to absolute power. In this realm, there were no limits, only the whims of the owner. But one of the most sinister powers was far more subtle. It was the power to completely unmake a person's identity. Slaves had names, but they were given by their masters and could be changed on a whim. You could be born with a beautiful name like Callista and end up being called Spatula because your master thought it was funny. You weren't a person with a history. You were a function. The cook, the accountant, that one who limps. Roman writers even mocked this, describing households where every slave was named Davis, so the master didn't have to remember. He'd yell, "Davis," and 5 men would show up. One would be punished for being slow, the others preemptively, just in case. This erasure was a constant psychological reminder of your status. And even if you finally gained your freedom, You were forced to take your former master's family name, forever chained to the identity of the person who once owned you. This absolute control extended into the most human of needs, family. Slaves couldn't legally marry. Their relationships were called contubernium, a tent-sharing agreement. It was a commitment, often deep and real, but it meant nothing in the eyes of the law. The master could permit it, even encourage it, especially because the children born would be slaves, adding to his wealth. But at any moment, he could tear it all apart. Sell the husband to an estate in Sicily, the wife to a household in Gaul. A couple could be together for decades, raise children, and be separated forever because of a debt or a simple change of mood. The family unit existed only at the master's pleasure. But just when you think the system was airtight, Rome reveals its greatest contradiction: the economic loophole. Slaves could, incredibly, own money. It was called the peculium. This was a small personal fund, tips, or savings from side hustles that, technically, still belonged to the master. But in practice, it was often respected, and a slave could use this money to do the unthinkable, buy their own freedom. Think about the insane irony of that. You spend years saving every coin you're given for running errands and simply surviving. Then you walk up to the man who owns you and use that money to bribe him into not owning you anymore. It's the ultimate paradox. And many masters allowed it because it was good business. They got a large cash payout and got to look merciful. The state allowed it because it created a pressure valve. It gave slaves a goal to work towards instead of rebelling. The owner controlled everything, but he couldn't legally prevent a clever, determined slave from stacking the deck in their own favor. This bizarre logic exploded in the most shocking place: the courtroom. A slave could not testify as a free citizen could. Their word was considered worthless. In fact, Roman law stated that a slave's testimony was only admissible if it was given under torture. The jurists believed a slave would always lie to protect their master, so the only way to get the truth was with hot irons and lashes. Let that sink in. The system declared a group of people so inherently untrustworthy that the only way to use them was to brutalize them. An owner couldn't just force his slave to give honest testimony. He had to hand them over to the state to be tortured first. The law recognized their knowledge, but denied their humanity in the same breathless sentence. You know his name. You know the famous death. But what you don't know is that Julius Caesar's assassination wasn't a tragedy. It was the final, calculated move in a game he'd been playing his entire life. A game of perception, power, and psychological warfare so advanced, it would shape the next 2,000 years of history. This isn't the story of a noble hero. This is the story of the greatest political manipulator the world has ever known. And it all started with a hit list. Before the glory, before the legions, a teenage Caesar was running for his life. The most powerful man in Rome, the dictator Sulla, had marked him for execution. His crime? Refusing to divorce his wife. Sounds romantic, right? It wasn't. It was a power play. A public, defiant middle finger to the establishment from a kid who had nothing left to lose. His family's wealth was gone, their status stripped. Sulla's men were hunting him through the streets, and capture meant a swift and silent end. He survived by bribing soldiers and hiding in the shadows, learning a brutal first lesson. In Rome, principles were a luxury only the powerful could afford, and he intended to become very, very powerful. But survival wasn't enough. He needed a legend, and he found one in the most unlikely place, aboard a pirate ship, captured by Sicilian pirates. Most men would beg or bargain. Not Caesar. He insulted them, told them their ransom demand was an insult to a man of his stature, and insisted they ask for more. He lived with them for weeks, treating them like his personal staff, joking that he'd return to have them all executed. They laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The moment his ransom was paid, he raised a private fleet, hunted them down, and captured them. True to his word, he had them crucified, but in a final, calculated act of mercy, or more likely, good PR, he ordered their throats slit first to shorten their suffering. The message was sent. Caesar's word was absolute, and his vengeance was both brutal and efficient. He wasn't just a politician. He was a force of nature. Now, to break into Rome's elite, you needed one thing above all else: the love of the mob, and Caesar knew how to buy it. He spent money like it was water, plunging himself into unimaginable debt. He borrowed from Rome's richest men, promising future favors, and poured every coin into public spectacles: gladiator games, exotic animal hunts, massive public feasts. He wasn't just being generous. He was conducting a transaction. He was buying the affection of the common people, creating a power base that existed entirely outside the traditional Senate. His creditors knew they couldn't touch him, because by now, he was too popular to fail. This wasn't philanthropy. It was a hostile takeover of public opinion. But he needed real power, and for that, he needed an army. He got his chance as governor of Gaul. For 9 years, he waged a campaign of conquest that was equal parts military genius and outright brutality. He defeated massive tribal armies, built incredible fortifications, and subjugated the entire region. The wealth that flowed back to Rome was staggering: gold, slaves, plunder, but so were the rumors. Whispers of entire tribes wiped off the map, of massacres and war crimes committed for profit and prestige. And who told the story of the Gallic Wars? Caesar himself. He wrote his own dispatches, his own commentaries, painting himself as the brilliant, benevolent conqueror. He wasn't just fighting a war. He was producing the propaganda, controlling the narrative from hundreds of miles away. He was becoming untouchable. And that's when his enemies in the Senate decided he had to be stopped. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey meant walking into a courtroom and certain exile or execution. He had one choice left: betray Rome to save himself. He stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the border of his province. To cross it with his army was an act of treason, a declaration of civil war. He knew the stakes. He paused, and then spoke the words that would echo through history: Alia iactus. The die is cast. But this wasn't a moment of reckless gambling. This was a calculated risk by a man who had spent decades stacking the deck in his favor. He knew his legions were loyal to him, not to Rome. He knew the people adored him. He marched on Rome not as a traitor, but as a populist hero, claiming the corrupt Senate had forced his hand. He was the victim, always the victim. He won the civil war. He defeated his rivals, including his former ally Pompey, and became the sole master of the Roman world. And that's when the real manipulation began. Viking winter survival. The shocking truth. Here's something historians don't want you to know about Vikings. Most who entered winter never saw spring again. Not from battles or raids, but from something far more terrifying than any enemy sword. The icy grip of Scandinavian winter claimed more Viking lives than centuries of warfare combined, and the methods they used to survive would horrify modern audiences. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about Vikings. No glorious battles in the snow, no heroic last stands. Real Viking winter was a slow, methodical nightmare that turned brothers against brothers and forced impossible choices between survival and humanity. Archaeological evidence from recently excavated settlements reveals survival tactics so brutal they were deliberately hidden from historical records. The Norse had a saying, "Winter reveals who you truly are." By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what they meant, and why some secrets of Viking survival were never meant to be uncovered. The brutal mathematics of death. Picture this: a Viking settlement of 200 people entering October. By March, maybe 120 would emerge. The other 80? They became what historians euphemistically call winter casualties. But these weren't random deaths from exposure or starvation. The Norse developed a calculated system for determining who lived and who didn't make it to spring. Recent excavations in Norway uncovered something chilling: mass graves filled with bodies showing signs of deliberate exposure during winter months. These weren't enemy warriors or executed criminals. They were community members, identified by their burial goods and location within settlement boundaries. The teeth marks on bones suggest something even more disturbing about how communities dealt with food shortages. Archaeological evidence reveals that Viking settlements operated on brutal efficiency during winter months. The weak, elderly, and sick weren't just neglected, they were systematically excluded from survival resources. Settlement hierarchies that seemed communal during summer became ruthlessly selective when snow fell. This wasn't cruelty, it was mathematics. Simple, cold calculation. But the most disturbing discovery came from Greenland Viking sites. Entire families found in perfect preservation, huddled together in their homes, apparently waiting for death rather than fighting for survival. What made them give up? The answer lies in techniques that even hardened archaeologists struggle to discuss openly. Underground secrets they never taught you. Here's where Viking survival gets seriously twisted. While popular culture shows Vikings in wooden halls by roaring fires, the reality was far more sinister. They lived underground, not by choice, but because surface survival meant certain death. And what they built beneath the earth would make a modern survivalist sick. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys across Scandinavia revealed extensive underground tunnel systems connecting Viking settlements. These weren't simple root cellars or storage spaces. They were elaborate subterranean communities designed for months-long isolation. The engineering was sophisticated, but the purpose was disturbing. These underground complexes included areas that modern researchers refuse to fully document. Chambers filled with human remains, rooms with evidence of prolonged captivity, and spaces that appear designed for activities historians won't discuss in academic papers. The Norse didn't just hide from winter underground, they conducted business that needed to stay buried. The most shocking discovery came from a site in Iceland. A perfectly preserved underground chamber containing the remains of 12 individuals, arranged in a circle, with evidence suggesting they didn't die from exposure or starvation. Tool marks on bones indicate something far more deliberate occurred in these hidden spaces during the darkest months. One particular tunnel system stretched over 2 miles between settlements, suggesting coordinated underground activities across entire regions. What were they doing down there that required such secrecy and such extensive preparation? The answer connects to survival practices so extreme they challenge everything we thought we knew about Norse society. The starvation protocol. Who dies first? Vikings didn't just ration food during winter. They had a systematic protocol for determining who deserved to eat and who would be sacrificed for the survival of others. This wasn't random or emotional decision making. It was a calculated hierarchy of death that reveals the true darkness of Norse winter survival. Archaeological analysis of isotope levels in Viking bones reveals disturbing patterns. Certain individuals within communities showed signs of severe malnutrition, while others maintained relatively healthy diets throughout winter months. The distribution wasn't random. It followed specific social and familial patterns that paint a horrifying picture of systematic starvation. The most chilling evidence comes from settlement middens, ancient garbage dumps. Layers corresponding to winter months contain human bones mixed with animal remains, showing similar butchering and processing marks. Chemical analysis confirms these bones came from community members, not enemies or outsiders. The Norse had developed methods for processing human remains that maximize nutritional value while minimizing waste. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Children's bones show evidence of being kept alive longer than adults in certain circumstances, but not out of compassion. Tooth marks and cut patterns suggest children were being systematically harvested for specific purposes that researchers are still reluctant to fully publish. The selection criteria reveal a society that had moved far beyond normal moral boundaries. The starvation protocol wasn't just about food. Recent discoveries show evidence of controlled breeding programs during winter months, with certain individuals kept alive specifically for reproductive purposes while others were eliminated. DNA analysis of remains suggests Viking winter survival involved genetic selection practices that would be considered monstrous by modern standards. When communities became war zones, winter didn't just bring cold and hunger to Viking settlements. It transformed tight-knit communities into battlegrounds where trust became a luxury no one could afford. Archaeological evidence reveals that more Vikings died from violence within their own communities during winter than from external raids during the entire rest of the year. Excavations at winter settlement sites consistently show weapon caches hidden throughout living spaces, not defensive weapons against outside attackers, but concealed blades and clubs positioned for use against neighbors and family members. Scratch marks on walls, broken pottery, and blood stains in hearth areas tell the story of communities that devoured themselves from within. The most disturbing evidence comes from family burial sites. Groups of related individuals found with lethal injuries that occurred during winter months. Based on bone analysis and settlement context, these weren't battlefield casualties or honorable deaths. They were domestic violence on a scale that suggests systematic breakdown of social order during the coldest periods. One site in Denmark revealed something particularly horrifying: a longhouse where an entire extended family was found dead, with injury patterns suggesting they killed each other in sequence over several days. The arrangement of bodies and distribution of wounds indicates a methodical process of elimination rather than a single violent event. What drives people to such extremes? The answer lies in recently translated runic inscriptions found carved into the walls of these same sites. Messages between community members that reveal paranoia, accusations of resource theft, and threats of violence that escalated throughout winter months. These weren't just survival struggles, they were psychological warfare campaigns that turned Viking communities into pressure cookers of human misery. But the most chilling discovery was evidence of winter leadership changes. Sites where autumn leaders were found dead in winter contexts, replaced by individuals who showed evidence of significantly better nutrition throughout the cold months. The Norse winter wasn't just about surviving the elements, it was about surviving each other. Spirits, madness, and supernatural warfare. Vikings didn't just fight the cold and hunger during winter, they waged war against invisible enemies that modern researchers are only beginning to understand. Archaeological evidence suggests Norse winter survival involved supernatural beliefs and practices so extreme they bordered on mass psychological breakdown. Excavated winter sites contain ritual chambers filled with objects that defy logical explanation. Arrangements of human bones in complex patterns, carved symbols that don't match any known runic alphabet, and evidence of ceremonies involving substances that analysis suggests were hallucinogenic compounds. The Norse weren't just trying to survive winter physically, they were battling it spiritually. The most disturbing evidence comes from preserved bog bodies found throughout Scandinavia. These individuals show signs of ritualistic treatment during winter months, with injuries and modifications that suggest they were sacrificed to winter spirits in increasingly desperate attempts to ensure community survival. The sophistication of these rituals indicates extensive knowledge of practices that mainstream archaeology refuses to fully acknowledge. Recent analysis of Viking winter artifacts reveals evidence of systematic attempts to communicate with supernatural entities, carved messaging systems, elaborate offering chambers, and preserved materials suggesting ongoing negotiations with forces the Norse believed controlled winter survival. These weren't primitive superstitions, they were complex spiritual survival strategies. What makes this truly frightening is evidence that these supernatural warfare tactics sometimes worked. Settlements that engaged in the most extreme spiritual practices show higher survival rates than those that relied purely on physical preparation. Either the Norse discovered something about winter survival that science doesn't understand, or mass psychological manipulation was more effective than rational resource management. The implications are staggering. If Viking winter survival depended on supernatural warfare techniques that actually influenced outcomes, what does that say about the nature of reality during extreme survival situations? Recent neurological research suggests prolonged extreme stress can trigger sensory experiences that blur the line between perception and reality. The Greenland mystery. Why entire settlements vanished. The most disturbing Viking winter survival story isn't about individuals or families. It's about entire communities that simply disappeared during winter months, leaving behind evidence so troubling that researchers have actively suppressed findings for decades. The Greenland settlements reveal Viking winter survival techniques so extreme they challenge our understanding of human behavior. Recent archaeological surveys of abandoned Greenland Norse settlements using advanced ground-penetrating technology uncovered something that explains why these communities vanished. Beneath the ruins lie extensive modification systems showing evidence of activities that researchers describe as inconsistent with known survival practices. The Norse weren't just adapting to Greenland winters, they were transforming into something else. Analysis of preserved organic materials from these sites reveals dietary changes so extreme they suggest the Greenland Norse abandoned human nutritional norms entirely. Isotope analysis of bones shows consumption of materials that shouldn't be digestible by humans, alongside evidence of physiological modifications that allowed survival on resources that would normally be lethal. The most chilling discovery came from the deepest excavation layers. Perfectly preserved chambers containing what appear to be hybrid survival systems, part shelter, part laboratory, part something that defies classification. The Norse weren't just surviving Greenland winters. They were experimenting with survival techniques that pushed the boundaries of human biology. Climate data confirms that Greenland Norse settlements faced winter conditions so severe that conventional survival should have been impossible. Yet archaeological evidence shows they persisted for generations beyond the point where normal human survival strategies would have failed. What techniques were they using that allowed impossible endurance? The answer lies in recent DNA analysis of Greenland Norse remains. Genetic markers indicating adaptations that shouldn't occur in human populations within the time frame of Norse settlement. Either the archaeological dating is wrong, or the Greenland Norse developed survival modifications that accelerated human evolution in ways that science doesn't recognize as possible. The one technique that decided everything. After analyzing thousands of Viking winter survival sites, researchers have identified one technique that consistently separated survivors from casualties. It wasn't physical strength, resource hoarding, or even supernatural rituals. The determining factor was something so simple yet so brutal that it reveals the true nature of human survival instincts. The survivors were the ones who learned to stop being human. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings who survived multiple harsh winters exhibited psychological and behavioral changes that isolated them from normal human emotional responses. Bone analysis reveals stress patterns indicating these individuals had developed neurological modifications that allowed them to make survival decisions without the emotional constraints that limited others.